Hello there. Today, as part of our broader series on Roman frontiers and the whole question of grand strategy and that sort of thing, we're going to look in a little bit more detail about garrisons. Now, in an earlier video I talked about forts, fortresses, all the different sizes of military installations, their layout, and emphasised very much that when you look at these, whether on a plan or as a model, what jumps out is the accommodation. These are not primarily defensive structures. They're not in the style of a medieval castle where it's the walls, the towers, the keep, whatever it might be, that's the dominating feature and the clear point of the design. This is primarily somewhere where it's very, very difficult to get in. They have their fortifications, but they're not as formidable as they could have been had the Romans chosen to make them that way. And instead they have lots of space. They have barrack blocks, they have barrack stable blocks, they have granaries for storage, they have houses for senior officers, they have a headquarters, administrative centre, they have a hospital, they have workshops, all of these things. So this is a place where the army lives, but again, it's very tempting from the point of view of studying the Roman army from this distance to view it all rather simply. And we see the physical remains, we see the traces of the layout of these buildings, and we think about their function, but we sometimes do it in a rather rigid term. So classic case being in the long debate about trying to pin down unit size within the Roman army, and how far we could rely upon Pseudo-Hyginus and his account of laying out camps, who tells us about the size of different formations compared with evidence from other pieces of literature. There was a tendency to look at the number of barrack blocks or barrack stable blocks if it was a cavalry or part-mounted unit of auxiliaries, and then from there deduce with each individual barrack how many pairs of rooms there are. Assumption is a contubernium of 8 soldiers in each pair of rooms, sharing those just like they shared a tent on campaign, which we know from Hyginus, but we don't get from anywhere else. You could then calculate how many men there should be in that particular unit, and then you looked and saw, well, in this place the Romans have put a fort of an auxiliary cohort. Here it's a miliary cohort, so it's double strength, 800 instead of 480. Here it's a cohors equitata, so it's got some cavalry. Here it's a cavalry ala, and try and deduce from the location what these troops were supposed to do and why there were cavalry here and not at the fort 10 miles, 20 miles away to the east or west. That does rather carry the assumption that the garrison of a fort is essentially tied to that fort and is there most of the time. That's really what it does, is garrison that fort. It's flipping things around. Again, back to the other video, talked about the civilian settlements, the canabae, the more formally the vicus, that grow up around every Roman fort and turn an even auxiliary base into a garrison town, rather than a simple fortification. And in the case of legionary fortresses, they're already pretty big structures anyway. Add in that civilian settlement, and you really have got something on the proportions of a small to slightly bigger size city within the Roman world. It's a lot of people concentrated here, a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of coin to spend, a lot of people, but it isn't somewhere that you would plan to defend against a concerted enemy, because it's the civilian settlement in particular has to be this sprawling thing outside the walls, but often built right up to the walls. If you look at the amphitheatre at Caelian, we'll go and do that at some point in the next few months. We'll do a video based around a visit to the site. The amphitheatre was actually built partly in the ditch outside the main rampart, and would have overlooked that rampart by quite a big margin. So it's not something you really want if you're ever thinking too seriously that you're going to be besieged. Sieges do happen, but they are pretty rare. This is when things have gone wrong. This is not what the army plans to do. The army plans to go out and fight in the open, because that's what it's very good at, and that's what where it tends to have a marked superiority over just about any likely enemy. So let's think more about these garrisons, because this rigid thinking that, oh, well, this unit is stationed there, therefore there is a reason why that particular unit is stationed there and in that place. And the focus very much on where the garrisons are, as this is where those troops are meant to be. And given that units appear to stay in the same garrison for decades on end, that's pretty common, then it makes the Roman army terribly static, at least in the way we imagine it. And this, of course, is misleading, and it clearly is not backed up by the ancient sources apart from common logic. You don't spend your 25 years of military service cooped up in a barrack block or doing things around the fort. There might be a few individuals who've managed to skive their way to doing that, or become too valuable as craftsmen or technicians or administrators or whatever to get moved around much. But on the whole, this is not a terribly good system as far as the emperor is concerned. It isn't good value for money as far as the state's concerned. If your army just sits in its forts waiting for a big war to develop, which happens pretty rarely, really. Again, we've talked about this a little bit before, and we will more so as we go on. So let's think about the things that troops would have to do in the fort. Obviously, there's the daily administration, and we'll come on to some of that in a moment. We'll look at, you have documents from Dura Europus on the Euphrates, you have writing tablets from Vindolanda that are essentially the written version of a morning report. Everybody's where they should be, this is the strength of the unit, equipment is where it should be, all this sort of thing. And there seems to be the pattern, particularly at Vindolanda, this is conducted by the Optiones and Curatores. So it's the Optiones, the second in command of a centurion, and the Curatores, the second in command of a decurion, are the men responsible for this as a group. But you also get Dura Europus, the issuing of the watchword and all this thing. We'll look in a little bit more detail at that as we come on during the video. So you have the administration of the unit, and its records are kept in the Principia. It's financial records, but also the records that follow every soldier all the way through his military career, and indeed track the animals and everything else using a lot of the supplies and equipment and this sort of thing. You have the treasury there as well, because pay is a big feature. Roman soldiers are paid regularly in hard coin, at least for the first, second, and fairly well into the 3rd centuries AD. Things start to change a little bit later than that, but the period we're focusing on mainly where you've got the best archaeological and papyrological and subliterary evidence to support it. So you have the administration of the unit, and you have facilities for training. You can't always locate it too precisely, but there does seem normally to have been a training area, parade ground, flattened, cleared space outside any fort. Sometimes there's evidence of a rostra, speaker's platform, where the commander or any visiting dignitary could review a parade. There's opportunities for drill, for weapons training. You have, for instance, from Vindolanda, those ox skulls with the marks of ballista bolts in them that have been used, obviously put on a post and used as a target for training. That's going on. How often and the details of it are things that don't tend to be covered in any great detail. But there are these activities within the fort, and again we'll look at some evidence for those later on. But just remind ourselves, even at this point, if you think of a unit with horses, then horses need to be exercised. They might be allowed to graze at various times, they might be allowed to run around on their own, but they're also going to be ridden. And if you want to keep them in a decent state, that means you're not just sitting either just in the fort or just outside. You are tending to go further afield. And there is a great tendency, we talk about these units in the same place for decades on end, and we tend to assume they're sitting there all the year round not doing anything very much, which is clearly not the case. We have an idea of some of the activities that soldiers are called upon to perform, even when it's not, as we would see it, specifically military. So yes, there might be military occasions, they might be called off to take part in a campaign in the province they're in, but at a distance, or in a different province altogether. They might also be called upon as an escort force, a police force, to escort military convoys, escort dignitaries. Again, we'll come on to a little bit of this later on. It's striking when the younger Pliny is in Bithynia under Trajan, as a specially appointed legatus for what's normally a senatorial province. He keeps coming across these detachments of soldiers that are guarding the procurator, are overseeing a prison, overseeing traffic through a certain area. And every time he writes to Trajan and says, you know, I know you want as many men back with their parent units as possible, should I send them? In each case, Trajan repeats, yes, I want as many men back with their parent units as possible. However, in this particular case, there's nobody else to do this job. It's an important job, so leave them there. You get beneficiari, these usually more experienced older soldiers who are sent out to stations along the roads to regulate traffic, oversee things, give a sense of law and order. You have the Centuria Regionarius, this figure who appears in Egypt, appears in Britain, somebody clearly detached from their unit, a comparatively senior officer who seems to be, judging from the Egyptian stuff, a cross between a sort of martial police officer and the political officers on the northwest frontier. So there's a mixture of that. So soldiers are being required to maintain law and order because there isn't really anybody else to do it. You know, some cities will have their militias, they'll have in the east in particular a sort of semi-police force, but there's not many of them. The army is the main group of people the emperor can call upon to do things. So they're doing that sort of thing. They're also building. They're out there constructing military projects, constructing military-related projects like roads, and you can see obviously the traces of organisation, of building being broken up by unit in the construction of Hadrian's Wall, all the inscriptions there, and to some extent the Antonine Wall. And you see this elsewhere, but there are often wider civic projects that are carried out by the army. So, for instance, you can still see it if you go to the beach at Caesarea Maritima, on the coast of modern Israel. In the aqueduct there, you can see in situ the inscription set up by Legio X Fretensis when they built this. And, you know, it's nice. I'm not sure that I'll be able to show you the picture. I've got a good 35mm slide of it, but I haven't yet got around to scanning in my slides. But we'll see what I can find by the time we actually get to editing this up. And roof tiles crop up. It's clear for a lot of public buildings and perhaps other projects as well, the army becomes involved. Again, going back to Pliny, time and again when he's governor of Bithynia, he asks Trajan for a military engineer to oversee civic projects, theatre building, canal building, this sort of thing, because the army has the reputation of having the best engineers out there. And perhaps also involving the state and the emperor via the army in anything gave it a greater chance of success, a bit more authority for anyone actually organising the project itself. So in each case there again, Trajan says, no, you know, surely you can find somebody on the spot who knows how to do this. There must be architects, there must be engineers there. But that gives an idea of the army's involvement. In Western provinces in particular, and imperial provinces in general, the governor, the legatus of the province, will have detached from the units of the garrisons in his province a large number of soldiers. Some of them are there as escort troops, a force at his immediate disposal of both infantry and cavalry, but a lot of them are there as clerks, administrators, record keepers. So there's the sort of governor's cohort, term that's been in use for a long time under the Republic as well. You're attached to his staff and you will be stationed there doing other things. And other officials will probably have that. If you think to Boudicca's rebellion, when Decianus Catus, the procurator of Britain who stirred things up in the first place, gets a request from the veterans at Candidadonum for help, he sends this group of Tacitus Scratum, sort of poorly equipped troops. They're almost certainly these men detached on other duties who've just been rounded up and said, go off there and defeat this rebellion. It doesn't go terribly well, as you might expect. There's involvement in industry. You have mine working. There's one governor under Claudius who is given the ornaments of a triumph, the highest honour you can give to a governor for opening up mine works in Moesia, that area. There's involvement in the mines in Britain of silver, of lead, of useful things, essentially. Legio II Augusta, Caelian are involved in draining the salt marshes along the Bristol Channel, area that still is now farmland to this day. Whether with rising sea levels that will change again, but nevertheless for the best part of 2,000 years it's been usable farmland because it was reclaimed by the Romans. So the army does get involved in all of these things, and the army has lots of specialists, and these are not what we would consider to be formal military roles. So there's lots that isn't about campaigning, but it takes soldiers away from their garrisons. But more generally, there's a sense, I mean, we look at all, again, back in the last video on forts, fortlets and all that sort of thing, there are a lot of small-scale outposts that we can see archaeologically dotted around quite a few provinces, and it's worth thinking about who is there, which troops are actually sent to perform these duties. And we'll come on to more of that as we go along. So that's really the introduction, and I don't think, is there anything else? I'm going with notes with some of this because there's lots of quotes, and we get further on that I can't commit to memory, at least not precisely enough. So again, we could talk more about the regional centurions. We could talk about in more detail about some of the building projects, this sort of thing, relationships between soldiers and civilians. We've talked a little bit about that elsewhere, but instead I'm going to go on and make some use of, because there are nice convenient slides, a talk I gave some years ago about detachments of soldiers outposting and soldiers' duties and that sort of thing, which it just helps to give us an idea. Again, remember, we've got these lines of towers, these fortlets, these small bases. There is evidence for soldiers in areas where their unit is clearly not present at that time. So you get soldiers, there's some evidence for them in towns at various periods and elsewhere. Also, if you look at army bases, something of a surprise to archaeologists for a while, because we just got used to thinking in a certain way. We can identify the garrison by the type of fort, maybe by inscriptions that tell us the unit's name, and then we tended to think very much that, well, that's what's going to be there, particularly in the more settled periods. In the initial conquests... Oh, excuse me, Gussie, do you want to go out? Sorry, Augustus the cat is making his presence found prowling around my chair. No, I think he's okay at the moment. He's obviously going to... He might jump up behind me. There's a laundry basket behind me, and sometimes he goes in there and zip, there you go. You might have caught a flash of fur as he went past. He's now going to curl up in the bottom of the laundry basket, which is empty because I've got the washing on, but it's one of his snug little dens, the way cats like to be, sort of hidden away. Sometimes we could get a little bit too rigid. So there was this theory for a while that when we found traces of lorica segmentata, the banded armour that's associated with legionaries in bases that we felt were auxiliary bases, well, does that mean that auxiliaries are using this equipment? Because obviously it's it's viable, it's good equipment, and a lot of their military role is quite similar. The problem is that's thinking too rigidly, and it's assuming that individuals and small detachments are not moving around. So, for instance, you have a cooking pot, a trullius, from a trooper of a cavalry ala is present at Caerleon. Now, Caerleon is the fortress, the base of Legio II Augusta. This man's from an auxiliary cavalry unit and has been there long enough to, leave his little saucepan thing, basically. But again, no one who's been in a modern army would be surprised with detachments, individuals passing through all sorts of other bases for training, for all sorts of activities. We shouldn't think the Romans are just sitting there waiting to be studied. That's always the problem. It's always the temptation. Your evidence comes to become so important to you that you forget to remember all the things that you don't see. All the things for which there is not evidence. Again, the Vindlander tablets rather suggest there are legionaries passing through that base that is clearly an auxiliary base. So things are messy, people move around. And even if you go back to Caesar's day and the Republic, there are clear traces of troops being detached from their main unit, possibly not very far distance-wise, but nevertheless operating separately. So you can see this, the implication of the siege lines at Numantia from 2nd century BC Spain, again suggests that you've got small outposts. Caesar talks about the lines of forts and fortlets at Dyrrhachium in 48 BC. In one place, Volcatius Tullus sustained with 3 cohorts the attack of a legion and drove it from its position. In the Castellum, that's one of these small outposts, there was not a single one of the men who was not wounded, and 4 centurions out of 1 cohort lost their eyes. 30,000 arrows were picked up in the fort, so Caesar claims. The shield of the centurion Sciver had 120 holes in it from arrows that had struck home. So That's a clear case where, in this case, he's got taken 3 cohorts and they've been stationed in this complex of little forts and fortlets. As part of the siege works around Dyrrhachium, they've been involved in heavy fighting. Again, think back to Alesia and the siege lines there, where again there are main bases with the legions in, but there are other smaller outposts around as well. Troops will go for this. All very logical and sensible. We've already talked about this, I think, in the forts and camps and fortlets one. Hyginus talks about the pattern of laying out tents for a century, and says that since 16 men from each centuria are on guard duty at any one time, they do not pitch more than 8 tents per centuria. So the idea is that basically, as you go on stag, as you go on guard duty, you come out of your bedroll and blankets, and the people who are just coming off duty go into the warm area, and so on. Again, it's a little rigid, and again it rather implies, because this is a theoretical manual, that your century actually consists of 80 men with 10 contubernia and, in theory, 10 tents. And that, of course, is something of a fixed idea with many scholars that I think it's wearing down now, but it's taken a while, because again, there's very much the assumption that, well, you have this organisation and therefore you actually want it to work, so a cohort has to be 480 men, or cohors equitata 480 and 120 cavalry, in order to function, in order to perform its role. And while there may be battlefield losses in others, basically speaking, the army is trying very, very hard to stay at that theoretical strength. It's not the way that anybody who's had any experience of most large organisations, let alone a military organisation, it's not an assumption they'd make, because reality is much messier than that. And it's abundantly clear there in the ancient world as well. Talked before about how Caesar's legions dwindle in numbers during the course of the Gallic campaigns and the civil wars, so that Pharsalus, his legion's about half the size of Pompey's. By the time you get to Alexandria, Legio VI has only got about 1,000 men on the strength. But there are others who are detached duty, recovering from wounds, from sickness, from all this sort of thing. And of course it's to do with the pattern of recruitment. Now, one sense we get of the sort of training that could occur when units are in and around their garrisons comes from a series of inscriptions that record the speech delivered by the Emperor Hadrian in North Africa at Lambysis to Legio III Augusta and the auxiliary units of the province, some that have just been performing a series of parades, manoeuvres, exercises that the emperor has inspected. And we get this sense of corporate training. Again, most of the archaeological evidence, the descriptions of Vegetius, are much more about individual training. You're fencing against a post, you're at Vindlander, you're shooting at ox skulls, this sort of thing. And of course that's important, but there's also the group training, the unit training, where you're drilling as a formation, you're doing all the things. All the stuff Josephus talks about very grandly as the Roman army, its drills are like bloodless battles and its battles bloody drills. That idea, that's an ideal. The reality is nowhere near as neat or as perfect as that, but nevertheless it again reflects the ideal that this is an army that should train and prepare for its military role, even in peacetime, even when there isn't a campaign going on. It's always hard to tell. There have been various suggestions of a couple of the hill fort sites that show Roman camps around them and evidence of artillery fire, that these are training areas for the Roman army. I think, on the whole, the more you look at it, the more likely these are to be actual sieges. In the Brecon Beacons, there does seem to be an area where you've got lots of practice camps, where units have gone out and within the same small area have made these little camps. That does look like training, unless it's just this, for some reason, people, whenever they march through in small detachments, are always building camps here, when most of the distances involved in the area you could probably get to a fort every night anyway. It's very hard to tell when something is done as training and when it's done for real, without very extensive excavation and then the hope that things are preserved very well in the area. Now, one of the things that Hadrian talks about, an auxiliary unit has built a fort, as part of the drill and exercise. So it's clearly something, the concept is there. It's a very practical thing. Obviously, you don't want to go off on campaign when there is a serious enemy threat and tell people, right, you've got to build a marching camp. If they've never done it before, then it really is a hard learning curve. So like any professional army, one that is not constantly at war but might be, they train, but they train depending on other requirements for their time, the diligence of the leaders involved, and they might train cleverly or they might train in a fairly mechanical way that gets them used to bad habits in many respects, because that's what works on exercise. All of these things are there. These are human beings, and they'll act as more modern people do. So let's talk about Hadrian's part of his main speech to 3rd Augusta. And it's quite interesting because what he tells us, he's very keen on Catulinus, his legate, their commander. He praises again and again. And I remember reading some of this stuff when I was in the OTC at Oxford, and we'd go off on an exercise for the weekend. It would end up after the whole index thing, and you'd get a pep talk usually from the colonel, who would tell you things. There would be criticism and things, right, you did this, but you need to learn to do that better, and all this sort of thing. But basically it was all very inspiring. It was a sense of, well done, chaps. That was how it all worked out. And you would begin positively, say some positive things, there'd be some criticism, there'd be suggesting, well, this is how you do that better, and then it would all end up with, but everybody was doing well and it was all in good spirit and all this sort of thing. Hadrian's speech is exactly like that, and I dare say in many a business and something, if you've actually got somebody, has any capacity at all for leadership, this is the sort of thing they do, because it works. So, Catulinus, my legate, is keen in your support. Indeed, everything that you might have put to me, he has himself told me on your behalf. So, he's basically setting up, these are the reasons, not excuses so much, but the reasons why you might not have performed as well as I'd expect. It is that a cohort is away because, taking turns, one from this legion is sent every year to the staff of the proconsul. So that's the proconsul of the province of Africa proconsularis. Enough. The legion is based in the province of Numidia. That's an imperial province and has a legionary garrison. So in this case, you have a legionary cohort going every year to help out the governor. Probably not that much for fighting, but perhaps for police duties and to show the flag, and also as administrators, whatever it might be, to add some dignity. A Roman governor will look more impressive if he's got an escort of highly polished legionaries. That 2 years ago you gave a cohort and 5 men from each centuria to the fellow 3rd Legion, that many, so that's Cyrenaica or Gallica, I think are the 2 thirds that are around at the time. So we don't know which one, we don't know how far away they've gone, but presumably that legion didn't have the manpower that it required, whether that was through losses, whether it's suddenly been tasked with the prospect or the reality of a major campaign and it needs to be brought up to strength quickly. So, it's an interesting way, the mindset that, okay, well, how many other 3rd legions have we got? They're not really connected another way, but that's an easy way of sending men. Again, bear in mind, in the aftermath of the heavy losses, particularly to 9th Hispana in Boudicca's rebellion, detachments come from legions on the Rhineland, several thousand of them altogether, to bring the legions back up to strength. So this is a fairly normal thing, and that after that there are many far-flung outposts keep you scattered, that twice within our memory have not only changed fortresses but built new ones. So you've moved base a couple of times as well. For this I would have forgiven you if something had come to a halt in your training, but of course the whole point is actually, no, you've done marvellously, and I'm very pleased with you, and in spite of all these difficulties, these obstacles, you're behaving as I expect a legion should. And then he goes on to praise the legate, all the senior officers, the centurions. They get a special pat on the head for doing their job. So again, this is a case where the province is on the whole peaceful. Those far-flung outposts suggest that there is perceived to be a threat, even if it is one more of crime, banditry, lower level violence than a major invasion or anything like that. But nevertheless, if you're caught up in these skirmishes, they can be just as nasty as a big battle. You've lost a cohort, plus again, it's interesting, 5 men from each century elsewhere. So they've taken detachments now, and in any age that can always be a question of does the unit involve choose the 5 best men to go off somewhere else, or are they the 5 that they don't want around? Shifting the crud, that sort of idea, where it all depends really, I suspect, on how important this is for the status and reputation of the Legion, that your men out there perform well, whether you're anticipating getting them back. Will some of these men be permanently transferred away, in which case good riddance? We don't quite know, but these are human beings. The whole range of possibilities will apply. Let's go to a military situation in the same broader area, the war against Tacfarinas in Numidia under Tiberius, just because it talks about how on campaigning, again, you can spread units out from the formal sense of this is a legion, this is a cohort. So we've got in the centre the flower of the troops commanded by the commander himself, who by securing appropriate positions with fortresses or entrenchments had rendered the whole district cramped and dangerous for his enemies. Turn where they would, they found some part of the Roman forces on the front, on the flank, often in the rear. Numbers were destroyed or entrapped by these methods. Next, the commander subdivides his tripartite army. He's been operating with 3 columns. Now this army is based around, at one point it goes up to 2 legions plus auxilia, but then most of the time it's down to 1 plus auxilia. Yet more numerous detachments headed by centurions of tested courage. So that suggests that you're operating at a level where you're not using independent auxiliary cohorts necessarily, and you might not even be using a full legionary cohort, though that's possible. Not even when summer was spent would he fall in with the custom of withdrawing his men and quartering them for winter's rest. Campaign was just opening, he arranged his chain of forts, and then flying columns of men familiar with the deserts kept hounding Tacfarinas from one desert camp to another, till at last he captured Tacfarinas' brother, returned too hastily for the interests of his province, left behind those capable of reviving the war. So, on campaign in particular, the neat organisation of this is a legion, this is a cohort, might not always be suited to the occasion. You have vexellations anyway, these detachments of various sizes that can be tailored to a specific job, and that's, in the end, practicality is what matters. So if you look at fortlets at the smaller bases of the Roman army, they don't seem to be designed to take a century, say, or any formal unit as we would understand it. They seem to be designed for a sort of small number of troops that have been, that's what you feel you need for the purpose of this particular base. So let's go back to barracks now and camp life. We have this intriguing document from Egypt which dates to late 1st century AD. It's from 3rd Cyrenaica, so one of these other 3rd legions that 3rd Augustus had to give troops to, or will do, a little bit later. And for a 10-day period, we have on a papyrus the fatigues, the tasks assigned to individual soldiers within this century. Now, they start off with 31 of them. That increases to 35. There are 9 men immunes, who are also named in the document. These have special sort of skill ratings, effectively, a status that means they don't have to do normal fatigues. Now, this doesn't appear to be, this is what these individuals are going to do all day in every case. Though in some cases they're often detached shooting, that might be the case. So it might be there are other activities. It's like, part 1 orders, part 2 orders, that sort of thing. But this is where you get information. And a lot of it, there's a familiar feel about this if you've ever been in any barrack room anywhere of the way an army would do this. So you get, for instance, gate guard, Helios's boots, that's probably cleaning the centurion's boots. Some men are assigned to boots. Now, whether that's looking after their own kit, whether it's repairing, maintaining the footwear of the whole century, that's another possibility, we don't know. A lot of these things are a little bit cryptic. You can be sent to the armory, you can be sent to the baths, you can be an orderly, you can be in the century, you can be escort to Primus Pilus. One man does that for 5 days, a chap called Gaius Valerius something. And then later on duty in Decimus Decrius' century for the rest of this 10-day period. So he's been out with the Primus Pilus, then he's attached to another centurion and doing something else there. One chap is there again, we could read it different ways. He might be at the harbours, or he might have been discharged. Another chap, duty in the century of Caecilius, possibly, somebody at a tower. One is away all the time on detachment to the granaries at Neapolis, that's outside Alexandria, where this is where the legion is based. Road patrol. Ad stercus you get, literally to the excrement, which presumably means cleaning the latrines. That seems to be the most likely. Another chap, escort to the centurion Serenus. So you're out there doing these things. You're with the standards, you're with the artillery. Now, is that guarding the artillery, cleaning the artillery, practicing with the artillery? Who knows? But it gives a sense of how these units would operate. Significant thing, no trace of a contubernium. You don't send a section off to do something. You don't send your 8 men as a group. You don't send the whole century off to do something. And these men, some of them are being attached to other centurions to do other things. Again, anyone who's been in any sort of modern organisation or army will not be surprised by this. A modern platoon, a modern section, fire team, that's very much a tactical organisation and used for certain things, but in a lot of cases it's not suitable, and it's more a question of individuals, right, you and you go off and shift that piano, or you're assigned to guard here, or this sort of thing. So it isn't rotating on the basis of a contubernium. And in fact, the only hint we really have of a contubernium doing something is that quote from Hyginus about the men being on guard, and even then you could read it as just it's that number are always on guard rather than those specific contubernia. Theoretical strength, you've got 31, then up to 35, plus 9 others, so that takes us up to 44 out of a century that should number 80 in theory. Now again, like an awful lot of armies in an awful lot of periods, you don't have the people you're supposed to have. You haven't been recruited up to the fullest level, and most of the time that doesn't matter. Again, 80 men in a century is an ideal, but reality is very seldom as neat and tidy as that. And so you've got amongst the immunes, there's a wagon repairer, keeper of weapons, range of administrative posts. Now, again, you've got the Julius Apollinaris, those famous letters where the chap joins up and gets made a clerk straight away because he's educated, he's got letters of recommendation, and has a joke about the friends he was with are out there breaking rocks in the quarry while he's snug indoors. So there are cushier postings than others. You have there's occasional stories talking about bribery of centurions, either to get leave or to get the nice, the easy jobs rather than the other ones, and no doubt these abuses occurred. Again, in a well-regulated army, in a well-led army, they would be limited to the point where they don't become a major problem as regards efficiency. So there you've got a sense of the messiness of the Roman army. But again, it's very familiar, as I say, to anyone who's had anything to do with armies. And it is all about, you have all these soldiers and you're using them as individuals. They might go, more than one person possibly has been sent as escort to the centurion Serenus. But again, they're not listed next to each other. You haven't sent a contubernium. You have sent as many men as requested, because that's what makes sense. And you scatter around, there's enough of the unit there. But with all these things, we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look now at some documents for auxiliary units that give a similar sense of dispersal, perhaps even greater. So this comes from early part of the 2nd century, and it's the Pridianum, the strength report of cohors 1 Hispanorum Veterana Quingenaria. That's stationed on the Danube in Moesia, and it's interesting. It's called Veterana. That doesn't seem to be any particular sort of claim to status and being experienced troops. What it looks like is that there were 2 first cohorts of Spaniards within the province at some point, so one got called the old one, the original one. It's like in the 18th century, and even General Hill refers to the 3rd Foot as the Old Buffs at Talavera. The nickname hung around. The 3rd Foot was the first British regiment to have buff-coloured facings. Others later on have that, but they'll always be the Old Buffs because they were the first. So it's that sort of thing. The cohort is very clearly, from when we read through, it's equitata, but it hasn't listed that in its title. And it reminds us that when we see unit names on inscriptions and other documents, they might not always give it in full because they know who they are. So why bother? It's commanded by Aruntianus, something Aruntianus the prefect, and on the 31st of December, we're not sure precisely which year, there are 546 men altogether, including 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 119 cavalry, lost number of duplicari, that's double pay men, NCOs really, 3 sesquiplicari, that's 1.5 paid men, and an infantry duplicarius, and some infantry sesquiplicari. That's always a word that I find a bit of a tongue twister and I tend to get confused with, so apologies if that happens. Accession, so you've had added on to the unit from the 1st of January. Something to do with Faustinus the legate sent them, whether they've been on in his cohort, in his staff or whatever, to return. There's a figure of 30 comes from somewhere, there are some stragglers. Total accessions are 50. As so often is the case with these documents, it's fragmentary. There are bits missing, so we can't tell all of the entries. So that's given us a grand total now, 596 men, including 6 centurions, 4 decurions, so many cavalry. It's got to be more than 119, or at least 119. Also including 2 duplicari, 3 sesquiplicari, see I told you I'd get that all mixed up, and an infantry duplicaris, and then a space where the infantry sesquiplicari would have been. So this is a very strong, in theory, as we understand it, a cohort like this ought to have 480 infantry and 120 or so cavalry, depending on the size of the turma. It might be 148 or something like that. So 600 or so men, and you're pretty close to that total in theory. The question is where they actually are. So from these are lost, posted to the fleet by the order of Faustinus the legate. So the legate has sent some men to the cohort, but also has taken some away. Don't know how many. By the order of Justus the legate, including 1 cavalryman. So 1 cavalryman plus at least 1 more, probably more, infantryman. Sent back to Herennius Saturninus. At least 1, the figure is probably, again with numerals, you can't always tell when how many digits are lost. Transferred to the army of Pannonia, drowned, killed by robbers, a cavalryman. Another group that are killed, we've lost the number. So total lost among them, again, we've lost this total. Returned from the stragglers 1. So net, don't have this figure, but we've still got the 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 110 plus cavalry. Again, we've lost the number. 2 duplicari, 3 sesquiplicari, and so on and so on. 6 infantry sesquiplicari. See, so suddenly there's a lot more of those around, but that might be because we haven't had the number before, so it could be that's what we've always had. So those are lost permanently from the unit. They're struck off the roll, in some cases discharged dead. Sometimes the letter theta is used to mark this in some documents, so there seems to be the slang term thetatus for dead, basically, DD, discharged dead of the Royal Navy. From these are absent, so they're still on the books of the unit, but they're not actually with the unit. And again, numbers are often missing. In Gaul to get clothing, also probably in Gaul to get grain. Across the river, Era perhaps to get horses, among them cavalrymen. At Castra in garrison, among them 2 cavalrymen. At Dardania in the mines. Total absent outside the province, including cavalrymen, is, again, the number is lost. Inside the province, so those ones have been sent out and they are a long way away, and some of them are quite small numbers of soldiers attached to other garrisons, posted there for whatever reason. Inside the province, you've got orderlies of Fabius Justus the legate, among them Carus at Decurion. So there are soldiers, presumably including some other cavalrymen, and a cavalry officer, a troop commander is there. In the office of Latinianus, procurator of the emperor, the procurator is the financial official of each province, so he's a sort of parallel administration to the straightforward legatus, the governor. At Pyraboridava in garrison, for those who read the novels, that's the name I pinched for Ferox's fort in the fort. at Buridava in Garrison, across the Danube on an expedition including so many sesquiplicari, 23 cavalry, 2 infantry sesquiplicari, likewise across to defend the grain supply, likewise scouting with the centurion whose name isn't fully preserved, including so many cavalrymen, at the grain ships including 1 decurion, at headquarters with the clerks, to the Hymus mountains to bring cattle, on guard over draft animals including so many sesquiplicari, likewise on guard over. Total absence of both categories includes 1 centurion, so that's 1 out of 6. That's significant, but not too bad. 3 decurions, 3 out of 4 are away from the unit. And presumably with this quite a substantial number of your cavalry as well. So many cavalry, 2 infantry sesquiplicari. We don't have the full numbers for all of this, annoyingly, but you've got a very clear impression of a unit that's being called upon for lots of different tasks. So you have most of the unit in one place and available to operate as a unit, but also, even if it's not busy actually involved in the war, to train. In terms of unit training, you've got quite a few people absent, and you've lost, especially if you're cavalry detachment. Now, cavalry, it's one of the reasons cohortes equitatae are so popular, in that they are these wonderful mini-armies that give you infantrymen and cavalrymen that can be used for garrisons, patrolling, escort, all sorts of things that... and they're cheaper versions than having a full cavalry ala. And the cavalry within them, they're not quite so expensive in terms of their horses, their equipment, so they're slightly second-grade cavalry, but they can do most of these functions very well, and they still have a battlefield role to perform, even if it's not quite as, they're not expected to be quite as effective as the men from a full cavalry ala. So that's a unit that's widely dispersed and in many penny packets. Even though we've lost the numbers, clearly lots of these groups are comparatively small, but they're scattered over quite a wide area, so it's doing lots of things. Let's come on to one from a decade or so earlier, strength report of cohors 1 Tungrorum from Vindolanda, dated to somewhere between AD 92 to 97, that sort of time. And again, it shows the widespread dispersal range of duties being performed. So on the 18th of May, again, got the date, day and month, but not the year. Total number of the first cohort of Tungrians, commanded by the prefect Julius Vericundus, was 752, including 6 centurions. From these are absent. Now, 752, it's not stated, but that's close to the 800 theoretical strength of a miliary cohort. However, later on, and as far as we can tell, probably even by this time, a miliary cohort would expect to be 10 centuries, each of 80, rather than the legionary first cohort, which is 5 centuries of 160. Again, those figures all come from Hyginus. That's really how we've based that, and then we've interpreted the barrack layout at miliary forts on that basis, and it does seem to bear it out. So you should, you think, have 10 centurions there rather than 6. So this seems to be some unit that either is a quinquennary cohort that is a lot beefier, has far more people in it than it should normally have. Again, while overstrength units are rarer in military history, they do happen. Sometimes you feel there is a particular need for more people in a particular task, in a particular role. Or it might be that this is an earlier organisation, more like the legionary things where each century is bigger in theory than 80, or that you are transitioning, you're eventually, it's not only recently become a miliary cohort. Again, we don't know. However, let's look at the men who are absent. So guards of the governor, the singulares of the legate, are 46 men. So quite a big detachment around there with the governor, who normally is based in London, but obviously can move around. It's a free country. He's allowed to do that. He's his own boss. At the office of ferox, possibly a legionary legate, so many men, we don't know how many. And that's the appearance of ferox. The my ferox in the Vindolanda stories is not supposed to be this chap, obviously, because he's not a legionary legate. At Coria, that we're 99% certain is Corbridge, so not too much further to the east, within a day's march. There are 337, including 2 centurions. At London, a centurion on his own. Somewhere 6 men including a centurion, somewhere else 9 men including a centurion, 11 somewhere else, 1 somewhere else, unreadable 45. So the total absentees are 456, including 5 centurions. Again, I'll flash up while we're doing that. We've got this rather nice coloured diagram of it in the it's in the cafe area of the Roman Army Museum at Carvoren. It's owned by the Vindelander Trust. So you've got one big detachment, 337 men plus 2 centurions, but that's more men per centurion than you'd normally expect, even with reinforced centuries. But that's an organised force. Now, what it's doing at Coria, we don't know. Is it building? Is it drilling? Is it training? Is it part of a field force being mustered? Who knows? As I say, it's not that far away. So they could even be on a short-term exercise. They've gone off, they've marched around, they're doing stuff, and then they're going to march back after that. But we don't know. We don't have, sadly, subsequent strength returns in the same period to tell us what happens to these people, how long they're there. You've got a centurion in London on his Todd, on his own. 2 other centurions with very small numbers of men off doing other things. Again, we don't know how far away they were. So the total is 456 men are away from base with 5 centurions. A lot of those men are at Corbridge, more than half, and there are 2 centurions with them, but there are still 3 centurions wandering off doing their own thing. It's a bit like the decurions, where there's only one of them with the unit we were looking at before. So the remainder present with the unit are 296 men, including 1 centurion. So apparently Julius Verecundus, the prefect, is there, but he's only got 1 centurion, one of the next grade officers, on the spot to help him run the unit, to do anything. Of these, 15 are sick, 6 are vulnerati, wounded. Now, as has been pointed out, the Romans don't really have a separate word for being injured in an accident. Wheel runs over your foot or something like that, some building problem, this sort of thing. I tend to suspect this is evidence for small-scale fighting, but also you can get accidents in training, obviously. So who knows? And then suffering from eye inflammation, 10. Subtotal 31. So the remainder fit for duty are 265, including 1 centurion. So that's very few people. It's less than a third. No, so it's about that. Or are there at Vindelander itself, and some of the ones who are there aren't fit for duty anyway. And when you think of the other things that need to be done around the fort, guard needs to be mounted, there are the administrators in the Principia, there are people looking after the granaries, running those, in the Fabricae, the workshops, doing things. So there's a lot of tasks for a comparatively small number of people. Again, we don't know how long the detachment at Corbridge was meant to be away and what they were doing. But it again gives an impression, not surprising to anybody who's been in the military in more recent years, of quite scattered units, of people being called upon for all sorts of tasks that take them away. It's a reminder that we shouldn't need, but just that these units do not stay at their bases all the time at their full strength, training and preparing for war. They try to do that, but that's one task, and there are lots of other tasks, and more often than not, they don't have as many people as they should have. The pattern is nearly always that your units are under strength. So let's go to another Pridianum, one of the only other one that's really very well preserved for an auxiliary cohort of this period. This is early 3rd century from Egypt, cohorts 1, Lusitanorum, so from Portugal originally. So here we've got part of it added to the strength, promoted from a cohort. A centurion has been promoted into your unit from another auxiliary cohort of Apinorum Antoniniana. Now, whether he's been promoted from one grade of centurion to a higher grade of centurion, whether this is his first time in the post of centurion, doesn't say. By Aurelius Septimius Heraclitus, the prefect of Egypt, from the soldiers of Legio II Triania, 1 centurion. So Triania Antoniniana Fortis by the same prefect. So the first man's been promoted by the prefect, again on behalf of the emperor. The prefect in Egypt, an equestrian governor, performs the same role as a senatorial legatus elsewhere. It's just that Egypt is the emperor's personal property. It's too sensitive to allow senators there. Another man being promoted into the cohort of centurion from a legion. And you do get these people moving from one branch of the army to another. Now again, is this somebody who's done well and okay, we can't give you a commission as legionary centurion, but go off to a cohort? Or is it, again, it would be interesting if it was someone who's been a centurion in the legion who's transferred to an auxiliary cohort as centurion, but we don't know. From the soldiers of the legion, the prefects transferred just one of them. From the same cohort that's mentioned before, 2 soldiers are transferred, and from a numerous, a unit of cavalrymen, another soldier by the same prefect of Egypt. So those are accessions. Those are people who've been added to your strength, and among them you've got 2 centurions and a handful of soldiers. However, you've also posted away by, again, the prefect of Egypt is the man who's, basically it's done in his name as representative of the emperor. Somebody's posted to the classis, the fleet. At least one soldier's been invalided out. Again, we have from Egypt, there's occasionally you get these medical reports where somebody's basically looked in and said, no, you're not fit to be a soldier anymore. So they're discharged. 7 soldiers killed. We don't know the circumstances of that, but again, it's suggestive of probably small-scale fighting. I mean, it could be accident fire, all that sort of thing as well, but... and among them killed are cavalrymen and a camel rider. So total of those permanently left the strength, 30. So again, you can see the same pattern of document, that these are the ones written off. These are not coming back. They've been discharged, posted away, or they've been killed. Again, you tend to think with a camel rider in, that's rather suggestive of a patrol. However, that's, again, he doesn't have to be on his camel all the time, so who knows. So among them, 2 centurions, 11 cavalrymen and a camel rider have been lost. So you've lost 2 centurions. We're not quite sure, the document doesn't preserve where those are and what's happened to them, but they could have retired, they could have been posted away. As others have been promoted in, they've been promoted out. So then we've got into totals. So the remainder, the total number is 457. Among them, 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 100 cavalrymen, and 13 camel riders. So this is again a cohors equitata, theoretical strength, 480 infantry, 120 cavalry. It hasn't got that many. It's got only 100 cavalrymen instead of the 120, but it does have, at least on its books, its full quota of officers, 6 centurions, 4 decurions. Because it's in Egypt, because it's stationed in the area that's useful, it's one of these units that has a small detachment squad on the strength of camel riders and for patrolling through the desert. There are temporarily absent in the Cora, that's part of the province, 126 soldiers. So you've taken a quarter of your men are detached, among them blank number of centurions, decurions, cavalrymen. And then you get lists of other categories. Again, these same sort of tasks that we've had before. For emoluments, there are NCOs, we're not quite sure. We're talking about duplicari, that sort of thing. Somebody's gone off to Coptos. There's an escort with him. 5 cavalrymen, Coptos with letters. Kaine to get hides. Again, the NCOs is probably these duplicari, sesquiplicari, and the like. Somebody sent to the office of the epistragus of the Thebiad. Again, this is one of the administrators in the Egyptian system. Somebody's detained by Marcus, the prefect of Ala Herculeana, an acting epistragus. Somebody's gone carrying letters. Somebody's been relieved from where they've been posted away, but they haven't yet returned, the lower country. So here you've got again that sense of a lot of the units scattered around, and clearly there are centurions. They are listed amongst those missing. They wouldn't say and no centurions. So centurions and decurions are being posted off. Cavalrymen are particularly in demand to go off on detached service and do things. So it's again a very similar pattern to the one we've seen elsewhere. Now, we get glimpses of the bureaucracy that's tracking all of this. The way we were saying very specifically, there's one man over here, there's so many men there. There are other documents that survive. Again, we get fragments and a small proportion of what once existed that track what individual men are doing. So again, from Egypt, we've got this chap called Marcus Papyrus Rufus, left for the granary at Neapolis in accordance with written orders from Titus Vedius Clemens, prefect of the camp. That's the commander of the legion. Returned the same year, 21st of January. That's in probably, went off in 80, comes back in 81. Left for the granary in the Mercurium quarter, 81, 82. Returned July 13th, 82. Again, these are the modern dates. Obviously, it would be in the consulship of, or using the Egyptian system. I haven't looked at these documents for a long time. Left for possibly guard duty, they conjecture, in 21st of April 85. Returned, left for the granary in the Mercurium quarter, returned the same year. So here you've got somebody who does spend significant time with his unit, but also a lot of time as well detached on specific tasks. Some repeated, going off to granaries, this sort of thing. Now, a Titus Flavius Saturninus perhaps, left to dredge the harbours on the 14th of January, returned, date lost, left with the centurion Timinius, again, returned the same year, November, left with Maximus the freedman, the empress, somebody on the field, and, you know, others, Titus, another Titus Flavius Vale something, left to make papyrus on the 15th of January 81, returned, left for the mint, returned, going through, left for the granary in the Mercurium quarter, and so on. Titus Flavius Celer, left for the granary at Neapolis, returned the same year, left with the river patrol, returned the same year, left with the grain convoys. So you've got individual soldiers being sent out to perform various tasks in the entourage or escort as people are assisting of various officials, going off to granaries, doing this. Again, they are away for substantial periods and they are going off as individuals. You are not sending a contubernium to do this. I know I keep banging away at that, but a lot of people naturally think, oh, you need about 8 soldiers, well, let's do that. Or you need about 80, let's send a century. The evidence is that very rarely was your century actually at anything like its full strength, and that lots of individuals from it and from the cohort and the parent unit in general were being sent off to do various things, or were tied down performing specific specialized tasks as craftsmen, as trainers, as administrators, whatever it might be. Again, the impression is that you're always on the books of a unit, and that there's nobody who has a rank that isn't actually associated with a particular unit, which means when you want centurions or decurions off to perform various tasks, then you've got to take them from a unit. There aren't lots of spare ones hanging around. Here we've got traces of a guard roster where you've got dates and names going through, centurial symbol as well at various points. Gives us an idea. This is obviously late when, you know, nearly everybody's called Aurelius Antoninus, and it's again that sense that a lot of you have duties to perform, so you're doing this sort of thing. You might be out there on the roads, you might be supervising those, you might be escorting people along there. Again, let's think about the outposts then. Let's move on from that, and you've got, again, a quote I've used quite often from several inscriptions where Commodus fortified the whole riverbank with forts, burgies, constructed from the ground, and also with garrisons, praesidies, stationed at advantageous places against the clandestine crossings of robbers. Elsewhere, you get the impression the praesidium is the place or the station. A curator is the man who's in charge of it. You see this particularly in the Egyptian thing. Or curator praesidii, sorry, is the commander. Various ranks. It depends on the size. The Egyptian evidence makes it clear, and just looking at the sizes of these little fort posts, outposts, and towers, the individual towers you get elsewhere, that you could be a centurion, a decurion, you could be a principalis, you could be a duplicarius, sesquiplicarius, and sometimes ordinary soldiers along the Red Sea routes, the routes of the Red Sea rather, where you've got these little outposts stationed and there's some ostraka from there. You have orders, for instance, the famous and sadly fragmentary one reporting a raid on an outpost and the abduction of travellers. This report is to be sent on to the prefects, centurions, decurions, duplicari, and curatores of the Myos Hormos route. Myos Hormos is the port on the end of the road. Mons Claudianus, the big quarry area that's overseen by the army in Egypt. The ostraka there have many references to Praesidia collectively or by name. So, the centurion at Claudianus writes to the curatores of the Praesidia asking they assist two soldiers who are engaged in a pursuit. He sent two men off to chase a fugitive or fugitives and assist them on the way. It's basically a pass to go through. They are where they should be and they should be helped. You get the curator of a Praesidium at Rima. He writes asking for two pieces of rope. Praesidia often seem to be associated with a water source in Egypt, which is obviously a logical thing. Water is vital, particularly on these desert routes in that area. So you get communications like this. Julius Apollinaris, the termer of Eponius, to Julius the curator, greeting. Please give Isidorus copper money, since I promised you whatever you send me from your own means. I borrowed from the village and I wish to repay. Farewell, your excellency. So this is someone asking the local garrison commander. It's fairly clear some of these are, as I say, just ordinary soldiers in charge of, 10 men. That sort of numbers, perhaps even fewer, perhaps a few more, but not large forces. Another one, Eponius Didymianus, decurion, to Julianus the curator, greeting. Please send me quickly Atrides, cavalryman of the termer of Antoninus, when you receive the ostracan from me, since the prefect has sent for him. Again, the army has tracked. There is an individual we know is at this detachment, this small outpost. He is required. The prefect wants him. The decurion sends the order to the man in charge of the station, and in due course he'll be sent back. So this is all organised and clearly tracked. And again, everything we've got, all these glimpses of the Roman army's bureaucracy, show that this is done very efficiently. Even down to a small scale. But again, it's about individuals. You are not sent out as units, these little garrisons. You're sent out as an individual to the total number that people want, that they feel is necessary for that place. So again, the description of that attack, it's clearly a very small force commanded by an eques, a cavalryman, who appears to hold no formal rank whatsoever. And he mentions the men who are killed and wounded are from different centuries, different units. So it's again, this pattern of a mishmash. Lots of people who are detached out and given a specific task. And in the case of these outposts along the routes down to the Red Sea, back and forth, a lot of it is monitoring the travellers, the trade going along it, levying tolls, making sure they've got passes, they've got permission to go there. So it's the same at Mons Claudianus. You get ostraka, these little fragments of pottery that will have things like let pass, Asclepiades, or sometimes just numbered, 4 men and 20 donkeys, 1 woman and 2 children, this sort of thing. You have, there's that interesting document elsewhere that talks about one of these small outposts arranging with a brothel owner to hire a prostitute to go, and basically it's all done legally as far as they're concerned, as well as the pass to get there, because they're stuck out in the middle of the desert. They've obviously pooled together their money to get there. You get in this area, apart from these little praesidii, these little garrisons, the scopoloi, watchtowers. So here from Mons Claudianus, I want you to know that I do not have a scopularios, and that it is necessary that a scopularios is present these days, so please send me a man. You wrote to me that I should make one of the 2 men you sent me as a scopularios, so send, so that I can make the one you will mention as the scopulos. Farewell. Some of these, particularly around Mons Claudianus, seem to be local civilians or workers who are tasked with going up a tower and keeping watch for various parts of the day. On the other hand, we also see soldiers doing this, so it rather depends where it was. There's an impression of some of them that overlook parts of the road that you might have had one man actually on guard and another man in the shade, ready to relieve him. So there's a duty roster referring to 2 duties for soldiers on alternate days, scopulos and something that's corrupted. Text from another site refers to a soldier at a scopulos. So there are troops who have been put up these towers to keep watch. On the other hand, you've got this from a different site, Herennius Antoninus, decurion, to Amatios, greeting. Since the son of Balanius, who is at the watchtower as a boy, speak to the decanos so that he may place a young man in his stead. For I also have sent orders to him about him, and send me the civilian who set fire to the reeds near the new Praesidium. So somebody's been up to no good or accidentally been starting fires, but this is a case where this is clearly a civilian man tower. We've got these like a night watchman, effectively, and the one who's there is a boy who's considered too young, so send me somebody a bit older instead who can be more responsible. This is dealing with the local civilian administration of the towns. But again, you're outposted, but you're connected, you're writing to each other as individuals. Again, from Mons Claudianus, Lucas to Hadrianus, his brother, greetings. Received from the wagon a coll, a blanket, and a chiton, that's a cloak and a pallium, different type of garment. Deliver to Valerius Hadrianus, cavalryman in the terma of Italianus at Claudianus. So, this is somebody sending things through to brother is more likely to be just a familiar term rather than literal. Claudius Archipios to Aristobulos, his colleague, greeting. I have sent Paprenis of the terma of Antoninus and Julius Antoninus of the terma of Tullius to Aphis on, this is the Egyptian calendar, Thoth the 4th, in place of Aponius Petronianus and Julius Apollinaris. I pray that you are well. Julius Apollinaris, sorry. Interesting here in that, again, those two cavalrymen are from different termi. So they come from different units, but you're sending them together to do a task, and they're replacing two men. So again, it's this at an individual level. You're outposting people off to these very small bases to do these small jobs. Let's move to North Africa a bit and consider some of the types of tasks that these little outposts might be doing. Some of them are reporting in, they are to do with the army supply, bringing in grain that's needed by men, that's needed by animals. So there's a whole series of ostraka from Bugem that record this sort of thing. So, to Octavius Festus Decurion, my commanding officer, Aemilius Aemilianus, soldier, sends greetings. I have sent you, Lord, by the camel drivers of Idibal, 7.5 Salusa of wheat, which is equivalent to so many modii, consuls in office after the consulship of Tuscus and Bassus. Later on, same man sends a different amount with a different camel driver, as he does again with the third one, 108 modii, 60 modii, and equivalent to 24 modii. So there's different amounts being sent to commanding officer, but again, via this note is being carried by the camel driver. So they're trusting a local, somebody who's a civilian who's outside the army, but who's basically the transport man, who's bringing these things that the army requires, various amounts. These are not vast amounts, but they're still significant ones. So you are communicating back and forth. The fact that you are at a detached post doesn't mean that you're cut off from the Roman army, but also for contact with friends. That's the point we can see in these various things. You are part of this system, messages are going back and forth. Here's one from Vindolanda to Flavius Cerealis, Masculus to Cerealis, his king, greetings. Now we know that this chap Masculus is a decurion, he says so at the bottom, but he appears in a few other of the tablets. This is the basis, we'll talk about this another time, where the editors of the Vinland Tablets are inclined to see referring to Cerealis as his king as just being rather sycophantic, but in the novels, for instance, I explored the idea, and it's certainly possible he was actually from the royal line of the Batavian tribe. So this is where you're taking, he's a Roman citizen, he's an equestrian, he's commanding a unit of his fellow Batavians, but there's other relationships going on. Anyway, please, my lord, give instructions as to what you want us to have done tomorrow. Are we to return with the standard? Standard is sort of shorthand for unit, to possibly the shrine at the crossroads altogether, or every other one of us. So all of us or half of us. Most fortunate, and you will be well disposed to me. My fellow soldiers have no beer. Please order some to be sent. To Flavius Cerealis, prefect from Masculus Decurion. It's the famous, we have no beer, please send some. But this is clearly somebody who's out performing a task with at least some men under his charge, whether it's his turma, whether it's a mixture of people, but he's perhaps been somewhere. The men who don't have beer, you assume, are stationed somewhere, even if temporarily. And what do I do? So this is a back and forth. No, I've been out, I've done this. Do you want all of us back at the fort? Do you want half of us back at the fort? Again, used this before. This tracking of individuals and units is reflected in, the animals as well. So this one of the the horse, 4 years old, reddish mask without brands, approved by me, an officer, and assigned to a trooper of the 20th Guild of Palmarines, and rated. This is its value, 125 denarii. That's what it's worth. So one thing that's a common theme in a lot of the documents we've looked at is the number of cavalrymen in particular who are scattered around as individuals. Bear in mind, in these little outposts, having a cavalryman present gives you an extra bit of nobility, not necessarily to go out and chase people or fight people. It might be to go out and look and find for them, but it in particular allows you to send messages that much faster. So let's think about this. What I've tried to present is all this evidence that shows us a Roman army where the units are widely dispersed. They are often under strength. They often have quite a lot of their personnel stationed in different places, doing various tasks. And it seems to be particularly true that officers are detached very, very often because they're useful. A centurion is a man of considerable authority, so is a decurion to a lesser extent. They can represent the Roman Empire in an area. These centurio and these regionari, the regional centurions that crop up, these are men detached from their units, and they're still presumably on the books there, but they're off for what appears to be very long periods, semi-permanently, going off being these local administrators, officials, policemen. So, the moral is, just because there are walls, it doesn't mean you have to stay behind them. Because you've built a base doesn't mean you're there all the time. Oh, excuse me. So we can talk a lot about the sort of people going out to outposts. It's worth bearing in mind, in some areas, some of the troops detached from the Palmyrines at Dura Europus are in bases several days' march away, a long distance, stationed further along the river in quite small detachments. On the other hand, if you look at, Masculus the Decurion can clearly imagine that he's within a day's ride or walk, a march, if they're not all mounted, of Vindolanda, because do you want us all to come back tomorrow or only half of us? If you look at a lot of the outposts, the milecastles, the turrets along Hadrian's wall, forts are about 7.5 miles apart, so even if you're in the midpoint between them, you're never more than 4 miles or so less from a garrison, not necessarily your garrison. But does each fort provide the men for the nearest ones? If so, how long do they go there? How long do they stay there? What's the system of rotating? Are people detached on a longer term basis? Is it as messy as it appears to be elsewhere, where you've got just individuals and your cohort is obliged to provide so many men for this particular outpost, but there might be other units that are also providing a number? The evidence, there is a little bit of evidence, some of the milecastles, for the presence of horses, and that reminds you, lots of these detached cavalrymen that give you that ability to convey information and send messages much quicker, and also a longer reach in terms of going out patrolling, scouting. So there are lots and lots of questions about how this all works, because we just get glimpses of it. There aren't too many answers. So some of the questions are just who does man outposts, and what's the basis for selection? And how far away from your parent unit might you be? The impression is often a very long way, and for long periods of time. How much time did the men spend there? Again, not much indication of this. Really and truly, you might spend the odd overnight in a milecastle in Hadrian's Wall, but it'd be perfectly possible for you to go back to garrison every day or two. You might... on the other hand, you could go there and settle up there. You've got a roof over your head, you've got facilities for cooking, you might be there for a week or more. Potentially, you could be dumped there for a long time or sent there, and you might be quite happy to be out of the way in this quiet spot, monitoring people going through. On the other hand, you're so close to a major base, that you could also be back at that. With the Canabai, the Vicus, the settlement outside, there's rather more entertainment on offer around one of those than there is in a mile castle. Depends a bit on your temperament. What's the command structure of these outposts? That's one that's pretty baffling. Clearly along the Miles Hormos road, it seems to be based around the main garrisons at Miles Hormos. You're reporting to them, and they're sending out the detachment. So there seems to be some area. How it works on Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, with other fortlets, lines of towers, this sort of thing, much, much harder to say. And beyond that, what they're for. Suggestion is, could be a whole range of different activities. So let's come back to Dura Europus and look at a similar strength return to some of the other ones we've looked at. And here we are, we're into the, well into the 3rd century. On March 27, they've got milites caligatis, ordinary soldiers, 923. Among these, 9 centurions, 8 duplicari, 1 sesquiplicarius, 34 camel riders, one of them a sesquiplicarius, 223 cavalry, among these 5 decurions, 7 duplicari, 4 sesquiplicari. So you've got, this is a very large unit. It seems bigger even than normal miliary cohorts. You've got, that's the strength return of the day. This is back to the daily routine of your unit in garrison. The tribune sent the password chosen from the 7 planets, so it's Mercury Sanctus possibly. So that's the password for the sentries that day. And then you're starting to get into people are being sent off to do this, who they are. Again, not as clearly defined units, but as individuals who are grouped together for a particular task and somebody is put in charge of them. Some are returning from doing that. Again, Timinius Paulinus, a decurion, announced the orders of the day. Whatever may be ordered we will do, at every command we'll be ready. That's the formula that Harry Sidebottom uses in his novels to give that sort of very totalitarian feel to his Roman army. And on to other things. March the 28th, the next day, some slight changes in the numbers available. There's only 33 camel riders instead of 34, but one's been mentioned being sent off. Password again, chosen from the 7 planets, but it's lost. People being detached. On the 29th, there's various things going on. So you get this detail. You've got this unit organized, but we've got a little bit more detail from the 29th of March. There's people sent off, convoy the barley collectors. They're taken from a century, but it's not, you're not sending the whole century, you're not sending a contubernium. People who've come back, and again, others return, previously details sent to the governor with letters. Sent as wood gatherers for the bath, soldier from the century of Nigrinus, the decurion gives the orders of the day, and so on. So you've got this routine of a unit that is, the garrison is very much the headquarters, and it's the basis of the administration. It's the hub of keeping track of where everybody is, which it's doing with great thoroughness, and that can be called upon by the central archives, by the headquarters of the governor and all this sort of thing, so they do know. But it's supervising a lot of people. This is the centre. Dura Europus, generally speaking, much of the unit does seem to be there in the strength returns we've got. Though there are some significant drops in numbers that might be to do with detachments or even battle losses following a Persian attack and this sort of thing. But this is more concentrated. Some of the other units will depend on the circumstance. Some garrisons will have more men there a lot of the time, but others will have a very high proportion elsewhere. So let's return to our some of our questions. So first one was, who manned the outposts? Well, the impression is that overwhelmingly it's soldiers, but that occasionally you get civilians in Egypt in some areas. Perhaps there are levies, perhaps there are local militia elsewhere. So seeing something that is a tower doesn't automatically mean the Roman army is there, but it probably does. How much time did they spend there? No idea. The guard rosters, the one we saw earlier, has alternate days for guard duty, but how many days are you, you might get your rest day every other period, but are you there just those 2 days? Are you there 10 days? Are you there a month? Who knows? Command structure, again, seems to be attached to bigger garrisons in some respect, but we're not quite sure how. That's certainly the Egyptian evidence. What's the principal role? Well, again, that varies depending on where you are, what the perceived problem is. You can see parts of the Roman army as very much soldiers. You can see parts of them as more like a gendarmerie, a sort of paramilitary police force. There is action, but there can be smaller scale crime, smuggling, necessarily rather than robbery. There's also supply and control of movement. That's a very big deal. How often in these documents have we come across being sent off to the granary or sent off to escort the barley? Or that chap in North Africa who's giving these ostraka to camel drivers to, this is how much I've sent, so you better have this amount when you actually deliver it to my commanding officer. Famously, the one we've mentioned before, we've talked about particularly in the raiding thing, the attack on Patkua, this vase that's used as a, seems a bit more than ostraka, a fragment of fragments of pottery that we, or ostrakon rather, singular, we refer to. Sadly, it's broken off, but that's the report of Antonius Celer, cavalryman from the century of Proculus in the second cohort of Etrurians, to Cassius Victor, centurion in the same cohort, describing the attack by 60 barbarians on the outpost way station, the Praesidium at Patkua. Civilian travellers sheltering in and around the fort also involved. Attack began at the 10th hour of the day, went on until the 2nd hour of the night, and again around dawn the next day. Hermogenes, an infantryman of the century of Serenus, was killed. Also, at least 2 other soldiers wounded. And again, these cavalrymen, there's a cavalryman from the century of Victor, Valerius Firmus, and a horse wounded from the century of Proculus. This seems to be a case where the cavalrymen are not part of a turma, they're on the books of a century. Legionary cavalrymen seem to be like that in some documents. So it, again, shows how units might do things a little bit differently from the formal way we expect. But it's a mixed unit commanded by an eques of men from different parts, mostly seem to be from this same cohort, but nevertheless they're from different branches of it, different subunits of it. So you have this elsewhere. We've got from North Africa, you get reports of, the appearance of nomads and this sort of thing. There's a supervisory role sometimes in terms of, are people coming along, are they up to no good? The scale of the threat would obviously vary, and this is something we'll talk about far more when we talk about frontiers, the sort of problems involved, the way the Roman army operates and is distributed. I really, with this talk, wanted to give a sense of, just to ram home the point that simply because we have a unit based there, that's its HQ. It doesn't mean that all or even most of the unit is actually there. The Roman army is doing things. It is out there and it's doing lots of things. It does like to train and like to practice, but for instance with the Vindelander strength return, when most of your centurions are elsewhere, if you do drill, who's giving the orders? And you're not drilling to operate under the people who presumably will be in command if you were ever concentrated and sent off on campaign as a unit. But then you might end up being sent off on campaign as just detachments under the officers that are available. So there's a lot of improvisation. This is not the perfect way of doing it. What you don't have is a cohort at theoretical strength under its full quota of officers, NCO equivalents, training and practicing for war non-stop. It's got so many other calls on its duty and people are not there. Again, no surprise to anybody who's been in a modern army, but it sometimes is to scholars who are trying to piece together the Roman system, so get a little bit too rigid in the way they look at things. So you have people scattered around, you have people watching out for what's going on. With all of these things, there's a temptation to imagine drama happening at every little outpost. Clearly it did. We've got that attack on Patkua. There's other references within those ostraka from the routes to the Red Sea ports of raids, of bandits, of barbarians attacking, this sort of thing. And apart from that, you're supervising people moving along this sort of through this military zone, essentially, through a secure area, because a lot of the goods that come through will be exceptionally valuable, and there are tolls to be levied on them, and the empire is very keen on collecting that money, but also making it secure so that the trade does keep coming, because that's beneficial to everyone. So you might have a lot of activity. Some of it might be very much the work of, we'd associate more with police, gendarme, that sort of thing. Some of it might be soldiers fighting, some of it might be, you might have to do both depending on the situation. A lot of it might be, you're guarding a quarry. It's going to be quite hard for people to steal marble from it. On the other hand, there are ostraka there that talk of pack animals being stolen, other things being stolen, things that you could move being taken away. So you've got drama, excitement, but bear in mind somewhere like Hadrian's Wall, where you have all these turrets, all these milecasteles, with people in for at least some of the year, perhaps all of the year. The limes in Germany, where again you've got the outposts, the fortlets, the towers. People are spending lots of time there. They're spread out. If there is a military problem, if there are raiders coming in, let alone any larger scale attacks, from the Roman point of view, you have to defend everything because you don't know where they're going to come. So an awful lot of the troops detached in these stations are going to spend most of their time doing very little. And even if they, again, just because there are walls don't mean you have to stay behind them. The same way, just because it's a tower doesn't mean you have to stay inside that tower. Even if you're out and about talking to the locals, visiting the nearby farms, villages, this sort of thing, keeping an eye open on what's going on, most of the time nothing much is going on. That's likely to be the situation. There are very few frontiers that are constantly in a state of intense warfare. And even when there's a war going on, there'll be lots of quiet sectors. When we talked about all these outposts chasing Tacfarinas down or trying to restrict the movements of his raiders, a lot of them probably saw no action at all. So it's a reminder that much of military life can be very, very dull. And that could be true whether you're stationed in a big garrison and you're going through the same routine day after day, particularly if training facilities are limited. And if you're in some of these small detachments, then you can be very, very isolated indeed. So never miss a chance to quote Kipling if I can. And I thought of the bridge guard on the Karoo, about the Boer War, where in this case it's a small outpost among the sort of blockhouses that were built to, rather like the Romans were doing with Tacfarinas, try and restrict the movements of the Boer commandos to make it harder and harder for them to operate, that they'd come up against a force somewhere that wasn't so strong you couldn't take it out, but that caused you trouble and risked casualties that you couldn't necessarily afford. Because this poem gives a wonderful sense of the sheer tedium and isolation of small detachments of troops in the middle of nowhere who are waiting around for something that isn't much going to happen. In this case, they get the excitement of a railway train arriving. Obviously, that's not going to be the case for our Romans, but the arrival of one of these convoys coming through might have been a moment of excitement, of some travellers coming through, of being asked to do anything at all. Again, we don't know how long people are stationed in these places, but potentially it could be for a long time, and even short periods where there's nothing to do. You can get bored pretty quickly. So I thought we'd end with this. Bridge guard on the Karoo. The twilight swallows the thicket, the starlight reveals the ridge. The whistle shrills to the picket, we're changing guard at the bridge. Few forgotten and lonely, where the empty metals shine. No, not competence, only details guarding the line. We stumble on refuse of rations, the beef and the biscuit tins. We take our appointed stations, and the endless night begins. We hear the Hottentot herders as the sheep click past to the fold, and the click of the restless girders as the steel contracts in the cold. Voices of jackals calling, and loud in the hush between, a morsel of dry earth falling from the flanks of the scarred ravine. Till we feel the far track humming, and we see her headlight plain, and we gather and wait her coming, the wonderful northbound train. Quick, ere the gift escape us, out of the darkness we reach, for a handful of weak old papers and a mouthful of human speech. So we return to our places, as out on the bridge she rolls, and the darkness covers our faces, and the darkness re-enters our souls. More than a little lonely, where the lessening tail lights shine. No, not competence, only details guarding the line. These detachments are going to be away from the home that was offered by the barracks, the fort, the camaraderie. Now some people might be glad to get away from that. Oh, excuse me. But For others, there could be a sense of tedium, and as with anything else, some of these postings were surely better than others. Some were probably extremely uncomfortable, either too hot, too cold, or both. Wet, damp, depressing, with absolutely nothing to do. And you look at some of those milecastles on the wall where you're opening onto a cliff. Nobody's ever going to be coming through, but you're there to keep guard. Now, again, you're not being made to work, you're not being able to do something unpleasant. So it depends on your temperament, your inclination. Some of these postings could be quite a relief. The same way, being out in some desert outpost on the road down to the Red Sea, all of these things, it's a mixture. I quoted that partly because I like the bit about the debris of rations, because in front of a lot of turrets on Hadrian's wall, there's the impression that the men in them have just been chucking out bits of pottery, foodstuffs, other rubbish, essentially, into the ditch the other side of the wall, and they're not worrying about it anymore. You can look at the small finds patterns. There's some suggestion that people are there for reasonable amounts of time, though again, it's very hard to quantify. That sense of isolation, that sense of boredom. You're a soldier, Kipling's talking about a major war going on, and yet an awful lot of the vast number of troops that the Empire sent out to force the Boers to the negotiating table aren't going to experience much. And many of them might be quite grateful for that, because, an attack by a Boer commando is going to be a pretty dangerous thing. But it's from a point of view of motivating lots of often youngish men, that's not particularly inspiring. You're not getting the glamorous role, you're not getting the glory, you're not getting the chances of promotion. On the other hand, there might be some outposts where you've got a good chance of taking bribes from travellers coming through, from merchants. When you are a centurion put in charge with some men of seeing traffic passing through a city, if you're honest, you might just do that job conscientiously, but other people could think of this as a bonus. If you're a centurion being detached to the governor's staff, as some of them seem to be, better chances of promotion, probably a lot more comfortable and better food while you're there as well. So it depends who you are, what you want, what the situation is in the provinces. But this is an army that's scattered around. Lots of people are away from their units doing things. So coming back to the point of this, when we look at our map and we see these are Roman army bases, these are where the garrisons are, this is the unit that's garrisoned there, this is the type of unit, what sort of strength it should have, be a lot more flexible in the way you think about it. Far more is going on. Just because the unit's headquarters is there, it doesn't mean that it's there. Just because those barrack blocks are normally occupied by soldiers from an auxiliary cohort of this particular unit doesn't mean that people from another unit might not be there. That you don't rotate. Do you keep most of your Second Augustan Legion at Caerleon, a long way away from the action? Yes, some of it's gone up to build Hadrian's Wall, but do you also send detachments up there to do a period as garrison in one of the forts, and within that to go out and garrison other outposts? Does seem to be happening on the Antonine Wall. It's a logical thing in terms of giving your soldiers experience. Again, sometimes scholars have this idea you spend all of your 25 years just doing the same thing again and again. That's not a terribly good way of maintaining the quality and efficiency of your army. And the Romans are big on training. So how they did that, what sort of things you get sent off to do, and also it's a reflection of manpower. If a lot of your units are under strength, then you're going to make the best use of the manpower you actually have, and it might well make sense to keep a base somewhere down in a quiet area, because that's where you can go to rest, where you can go to train, you can be useful for local administration, building, policing, all that sort of thing. But also you might want to send out your the bulk of your unit to go off and operate elsewhere where more men are needed, where things are a bit more dangerous, to give them experience, to give them opportunities, but also because you're short of manpower and you need people and you're trying to make best use of it. So it comes back to this, Flavius Cerealis in the Vindlander tablets referring to Vindlander as his hiberni, his winter quarters. Something of that mentality may well have lost. This is where you spend the inclement months, this is where your records are kept, your administration is conducted, but it certainly doesn't have to be where you are. And the distances involved, even if you're only marching 10, 15 miles a day, which is not very much, then within a week you are a long, long way from that garrison, but another week could take you back there. So for the summer months, whether it's for training, large-scale exercises of the sort that Hadrian observed in North Africa, whether it's for a large-scale building project, or whether it's for campaigning. Even if that's a show the flag, go out and march around and remind any potential enemies that you are big and you are dangerous and you don't want to mess with the Romans, or actually going off and fighting someone, operating and everything in between. So a lot more's going on. Don't think of these as we see this cohort fort and that means the cohort is always there, and it's specifically in that place because it has a reason to do things at its full strength in that place. It's not how it works. This is a very mobile army, and it's as dynamic, as confusing in many ways, as complicated, as scattered as a lot of other armies have been at other periods. So anyway, that's it for today. It's gone on slightly longer than I'd planned, but and this might be one very much for the real sort of Roman army fanatics, but I think it is useful for our broader picture of as we're trying to understand frontiers and strategy and grand strategy and how the army operates, that we think more in just about what these garrisons mean and what these units are doing. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.